Hello, everybody, and welcome to Coffee with a Therapist on this lovely Thursday. I am excited to talk about anxiety today. And I know that a lot of people often think of anxiety as far as like anxiety disorders, or they may not realize how it impacts them in their own life, or may not even know exactly what the difference is between normal anxiety and an anxiety disorder. So today what I wanted to talk about was anxiety, what it is, and what separates it from normal, healthy anxiety and an anxiety disorder. So all of us have anxiety from time to time. That is totally normal. In fact, anxiety can be useful in helping to motivate us to get something done. It can be, a mover. It can also be a protector in the sense that it's important that we feel anxiety or a sense of fear if we're around fearful or toxic events or stimulus. So anxiety can be really useful in kind of being that check engine light of, hey, proceed with caution and maybe set some boundaries. A person who lives life without any sort of anxiety or fear would likely actually get themselves into trouble. And you can kind of relate that to a person like how we are maybe when we're drinking alcohol, or if our inhibitions are lower, how you'll see people make decisions that they wouldn't normally make because their anxiety or their natural ability to be anxious in anxiety-provoking situations decreases, right? And so it can serve a really good purpose in our lives. It's very useful. And some of us were quirky and we have anxieties that are related to specific triggers or events. Now, sometimes that's trauma-based, and so it's something that we can heal and maybe we should consider working through if it is a very specific stimulus or trigger. And sometimes that's not. Sometimes we just have our different little oddities or things that we're fearful of, like snakes or heights, that sort of thing. Even speaking for myself, as I've gotten older, I've developed some interesting anxiety around small spaces and claustrophobia. So acknowledging that like some of that's normal, some of that we might develop over time, but when we step away from that stimulus, if we're able to regulate and feel calm and peaceful most of the time, then it's not really an anxiety disorder. Now, if the stimulus that triggers us is something we have to face in our day-to-day life, that's very different, because at that point, that's something that we're having that would interfere with our day-to-day life and activities, because we never will be able to feel a long-term sense of calm and rest because we can't get away from the thing that causes anxiety for us. So I did want to differentiate between that. The other thing about anxiety disorders is often they will feel like they kind of come out of nowhere. So there may not be a specific trigger or stimulus that causes it, and it will likely be very confusing and not have a pattern to it. So it's anxiety that just seems to come from nowhere and not really have a stimulus or something that sparks it. The other thing too is often when we feel it and when we're responding to different things in our environment, we will react in a way that is disproportionate to the event or with intense emotion. So often if people struggle with anxiety disorders and they're in their anxiety, they'll start to notice they're feeling anxious because they get very emotionally reactive to even normal conversations and encounters and events, right? So if you notice that, you start to see yourself getting reactive or irritable or over emotional about certain things, it could be because you're actually dealing with like this chronic lower level of anxiety. The other thing about anxiety disorders is that they can last for a really long period of time. So with normal anxiety or anxiety that's triggered by a stimulus, again, we might only feel anxiety when we're around that stimulus, or it might last just a couple hours, maybe even a day from time to time. But with anxiety disorders, there's a chronicness, there's a long-termness to it where it could last weeks or even months and sometimes years. So anxiety disorders just has that longer lasting period of time that people are actually in that anxiety. So they don't tend to like oscillate out of it how we normally would if we were just experiencing anxiety as an emotion. The other thing about anxiety disorders is that it can feel like when we have that anxiety that there is nothing we can do to control or manage it. So if it's just one of those anxieties that, are lower level or something triggered by a stimulus, often we can do relaxation techniques, or we can kind of regulate our body systems and get out of that anxiety, or at least decrease the level of anxiety. Whereas with anxiety disorders, it often feels like no matter what you do, even if you try to relax, even if you try to take a bath or do deep belly breathing, you still feel that anxiety, and it's really hard to get out of, right? So not only does it last a long period of time, but it's also feels kind of unmanageable, and even when using coping mechanisms, feels like you can't get out of it. And then the last thing that I think is really interesting, and something that I see in a lot of my clients that they might even write off or explain away, is that often people with anxiety disorders, when they are not aware of their anxiety, or when they don't really call it anxiety, maybe they call it stress, maybe they call it something else, their body will keep the score, and it will show them, it will have different symptoms to show them, hey, we're feeling anxiety. And those are symptoms commonly like, digestive issues or headaches or feeling tired and wired, right? So our bodies will sometimes have these physical symptoms that will manifest. Even things like skin rashes can happen with people if they have anxiety long term or an anxiety disorder. And then more obviously, panic attacks, right? If you struggle with panic attacks and they seem to come out of nowhere, and they're not triggered by like some very specific event or trigger, that is a huge indicator that you may have an anxiety disorder or some chronic anxiety that you haven't been managing or maybe even acknowledging. So that's definitely something to consider. So when your body starts to show these different symptoms like digestive issues, headaches, lethargy, skin issues, sometimes autoimmune disorder symptoms, it really could be an undiagnosed or untreated anxiety disorder. I think it's really tough because a lot of people misunderstand anxiety, and often they call it stress, or they may call it something different. But the more that we learn about it, and the more that we are aware of how it manifests in our bodies, and if it is more chronic, if it happens to us more often than not, and if it feels unmanageable, the more we're actually able to deal with it and talk about it and treat it and work on it. Because what I see a lot of is people with anxiety that don't realize they have anxiety, and they don't realize the way that their anxiety is actually driving the bus when it comes to their life. So I think the more that we can be aware about this and understand exactly what it is and how it looks like in our own lives, the more that we can actually treat it and live lives our way and not based on our anxiety. All right, y'all, that is all I have for you today. I hope that was helpful. I am so happy to answer any questions you may have about anxiety or anxiety versus anxiety disorders. So please let me know if you have any questions or any feedback, and we will touch base tomorrow. Take care.